There is a particular kind of waiting that does not feel like waiting. It does not feel like patience. It does not feel like discipline or readiness, or the calm that comes from certainty about what is next. It feels instead like the moment between the lightning and the thunder, that suspended breath of time when you already know, somewhere below conscious thought, that the sound is coming, that it has always been coming, and that nothing you do in this interval will change its arrival. That is the kind of waiting that settled over the Atlantic Wall in the spring of 1944. Not the waiting of men who expected to win. The waiting of men who expected to be tested in a way that could not yet be named. They had built their defences across thousands of kilometres of coastline. They had poured concrete in quantities that staggered the engineers who calculated it. 17 million cubic metres of it, enough to build a road from Berlin to Moscow and back again. They had driven steel and timber into the sand and surf of beaches that, in another life, families had visited with picnic baskets and rolled-up trousers. They had strung wire that caught the light on clear mornings in a way that was almost beautiful, almost agricultural, the way new fencing looks across a field in spring. And they had waited. The mathematics of the Atlantic Wall were, on paper, formidable. More than 15,000 strong points, more than 1 million soldiers assigned to its defence at the moment of peak preparation. Artillery pieces numbering in the thousands, ranging from captured Czech and French and Russian guns pressed into German service, weapons that spoke a dozen languages but fired the same language of destruction, to massive coastal batteries capable of reaching warships 20 kilometres offshore. The fortifications ran from the northern tip of Norway, where the coastline fractured into fjords, so remote that no army had ever seriously considered approaching them, down through Denmark, along the flat beaches of the Netherlands, across the chalky cliffs of the Pas de Calais, and then curving west and south along the French Atlantic coast, past the long sandy stretches of Normandy, to the Spanish frontier. It was the longest defensive line ever constructed in human history. It was also, in fundamental ways that the men responsible for its construction were only beginning to understand, an illusion. Not an illusion in the way that propaganda is an illusion, fabricated from nothing, designed purely to deceive. It was an illusion of the more dangerous kind, the kind constructed partly from real material, and real labour, and real concrete, but shaped by assumptions that had quietly become obsolete without anyone quite noticing the moment they passed. The assumption that the Allies would land where it was most logical to land, the assumption that 2 million soldiers defending a coast could not be defeated by forces they could see coming across open water, the assumption that the wall would hold long enough for armour and reserves to arrive and drive the landing forces back into the sea before they could consolidate. These assumptions were the load-bearing walls of the German strategic mind in 1944, and they would not survive the first 24 hours of June. Tonight, we return to the coast of France, to the long summer dawn of a Tuesday morning when the mathematics of years of preparation met the mathematics of years of planning, and the world discovered which equation had been written correctly. This is the story of the men who built a fortress on the edge of the sea, who garrisoned it with their bodies and their belief, and who stood in the darkness of the 5th and 6th of June, 1944, listening to the sound of something they had been told would never come, or would come somewhere else, arriving exactly where they stood. If these long, quiet journeys into history help you slow down, to rest your thoughts against something larger than the ordinary noise of the day, if they give you somewhere steady to dry feet towards sleep, then stay with me. When you subscribe, you are not just supporting a channel, you are keeping this kind of careful, unhurried storytelling alive. And this story deserves care. These men, on all sides of what was about to happen, deserve the hours it takes to tell their story properly. Settle in. This is the German nightmare at Normandy. Early May 1944. The beach, At Vierville-sur-Mer, the tide has gone out. Obergefreiter Heinrich Severloh, 21 years old, from a farming village in Lower Saxony, a man whose hands had learned the rhythms of agriculture before they learned the rhythms of a machine gun, stood at the aperture of a field position cut into the bluffs above a beach that the German military had designated Widerstandsnest 62, or WN 62. Resistance Nest 62. The name was bureaucratic, organizational, stripped of everything except function. But the place itself was not bureaucratic. The place itself was the kind of coastline that made men think about permanence, about the slow geological patience of cliffs that had been eroding into the sea for 10,000 years without any urgency whatsoever. The morning light came off the water in a way that flattened everything to grey and silver. The sand was clean. The beach was empty. He was thinking about the harvest. Not literally, or rather, not only literally. He was thinking about what it meant to have come from a place where the measure of a year was what the land gave up and what it required in return, and to have arrived, through a sequence of events he had not chosen and would not have chosen, at this particular cliff, above this particular beach, behind a particular arrangement of concrete and steel that was supposed to matter in ways the men who designed it had not fully explained to the men who would have to inhabit it. The mathematics of his position were simple. He had a heavy machine gun, an MG-42, capable of firing 1,200 rounds per minute, a rate so extreme that to untrained ears it did not sound like individual shots at all, but rather a single continuous mechanical scream, as if the weapon were tearing the air itself rather than punctuating it. He had ammunition in quantities that seemed, in the abstract, almost reassuring. He had a field of fire that swept from Lafitte to right across a beach 300 meters wide, across a killing ground that had been designed with the cold geometrical intelligence of men who understood that the most effective way to stop an infantry assault was not to fight the individual soldiers, but to address the mathematical problem of putting enough metal into a given space in a given time that no living thing could cross it. He had all of this, and he had been told that the invasion, if it came, would come here. He also knew, because all the soldiers knew even when they weren't supposed to, that there was another school of thought, that it would come at Calais, that it was always going to be Calais, that every indicator, every intelligence assessment, every logical inference from the geography of the English Channel and the location of the ports and the distance to Germany pointed to the Pas de Calais as the landing site. He had heard it from officers. He had heard it from the officers above those officers, the name of the man who was supposed to know better than any of them. Rommel. Erwin Rommel. The Desert Fox. The general who had become something close to a legend in the years when Germany was still winning, was invoked in these discussions as a kind of citation, as if the authority of his name settled questions that the evidence alone could not settle. And Rommel, in fact, did not disagree about Calais. He thought the landing would come at Calais. He thought a great many things in the spring of 1944 that would within weeks prove to have been precisely incorrect. The Atlantic Wall had been born from a particular moment of strategic fear. In August of 1942, British and Canadian forces had launched a raid on the French port of Dieppe, a testing operation probing the possibility of a cross-channel assault, trying to understand what it would actually cost to take a defended port by direct frontal assault. What it cost was catastrophic. Of the approximately optimally 6,000 men who landed or attempted to land, nearly 4,000 were killed, wounded, or captured within a single day. The beaches ran red. The tanks that made it ashore found the seawall impassable. The infantry without armour support were cut down in the open with a methodical efficiency that the German defenders themselves found, in some accounts, almost distressing in its completeness. The lesson that the Allies took from Dieppe was that a defended port could not be taken by direct assault, that any future landing would require meticulous preparation, and overwhelming force, and an element of surprise that Dieppe had fatally lacked. The lesson that Hitler took from Dieppe was that the coastal fortification of Western Europe needed to be the highest priority of German construction effort, that the Atlantic Wall needed to be not a concept or a plan, but a physical reality, kilometers of concrete and steel and wire and mines, a barrier that would meet the next attempt where the last one had failed, and defeat it in the same way. The order went out in August of 1942. The wall would be completed within a year. It was not completed within a year. It was not completed within 2 years. It was, in a meaningful sense, never completed at all, because the thing that was being built was not really a wall in the way that a wall can be finished, a continuous barrier from one point to another with a defined beginning and end. It was instead a series of strong points, separated by stretches of coast defended only by the implicit threat that reinforcements would arrive in time to matter. The actual density of fortification varied enormously from sector to sector, from the massively constructed batteries of the Pas de Calais, where every logic of geography and strategy argued that the main landing would come to the comparatively modest positions along the Normandy coast, where the beaches faced north and west into the Channel, and the cliffs gave way to gentler terrain and the ports were smaller, and the arguments for attacking here seemed, to most German strategic thinkers, weaker. The arithmetic of the Atlantic Wall, examined with any rigour, revealed its own internal contradictions. For 15,000 strong points sounded, and was meant to sound, like a comprehensive defence. But 15,000 points distributed across 5,000 kilometres of coastline produced an average density of 3 strong points per kilometre, one every 330 metres. In reality, the distribution was far from average. The heavily defended sectors had 550 or 60 strong points per kilometre, interlocking fields of fire, multiple layers of wire, and mines and obstacles. The lightly defended sectors had almost nothing, and the Normandy coast, for all its reputation as one of the more carefully defended stretches after Rommel's arrival in late 1943 and early 1944, was still, measured against what was coming, thin in ways that would only become apparent when the weight landed. November 5th, 1943, Paris. The Hotel Majestic on the Avenue Kléber. Erwin Rommel, 552 years old, newly appointed to inspect and improve the coastal defences of Western Europe, sat across a table from maps that told a story he was not yet fully ready to believe. He had spent the previous 3 years fighting in North Africa, in Libya, in Egypt, in Tunisia, in a theatre of war, so different from what he was now contemplating that the comparison required a deliberate effort of mental translation. In the desert, war was movement. It was fluid, improvisational, built on the speed of armoured columns and the exploitation of gaps and the ability to concentrate force against weakness before the enemy could react. He had been brilliant at it. The nickname had not been given lightly, and the fear that his name generated among British and Commonwealth soldiers was not manufactured. It was earned through years of rapid decision-making in conditions that punished slowness and rewarded boldness in ways that were almost elegantly simple. The desert gave you room, you could maneuver. The Atlantic coast gave you no room at all, or rather, it gave the defender room, but only if the defender understood the fundamental geometry of the problem, which was this: any Allied landing force would be at its most vulnerable in the first minutes, and hours of feta leaving the water, before it could consolidate, before it could bring its own artillery ashore, before the logistics of the landing could overcome the physics of the surf and the obstacles and the fire coming down from the bluffs. The window of vulnerability was narrow. Rommel had looked at the maps and the tide tables and the charts of the beaches and come to a conclusion that was, in its way, mathematically elegant even if it was also strategically radical. The invasion had to be defeated on the beach itself, not behind the beach, not inland, where German armour could manoeuvre, and where the flat Norman hedgerow country would eventually allow the kind of fluid armoured battle that German commanders believed they understood better than anyone else in the world. On the beach, in the water, at the moment of maximum confusion and minimum capability. Because if the Allies got ashore, if they moved 10 kilometres inland, 20 kilometres, if they established a perimeter and brought their logistics over those beaches and began to accumulate the men and material that American industrial production could generate at a rate that no European power could match, then the mathematics changed. Then the equation that the Atlantic War was supposed to solve became unsolvable. He began to travel the coast. He travelled it in a way that was characteristic of how he approached every problem, personally, physically, with his own eyes and his own hands, refusing the comfortable abstraction of headquarters maps and liaison officers' reports. He walked the beaches. He climbed the bluffs. He stood at the positions where men like Heinrich Sevelow would eventually stand, and looked out at the water and thought about what was coming from the direction of England, from the direction of the massed armies accumulating in the south of Britain, from the direction of a force that had been gathering itself for 2 years, with the patient, implacable momentum of something that had decided it was going to happen regardless of what stood in its way. What he found troubled him. The concrete was there, in many places, the casemates and bunkers and observation posts, the gun emplacements and command centres, the architecture of defence that had been poured and cured and armed. But between the concrete the gaps were wide, and the mines were thin, and the obstacles that should have been filling the beaches from the waterline to the top of the tide, the steel hedgehogs and wooden stakes and Belgian gates and element sea barriers, designed to tear the bottoms out of landing crayfeet and impale the men who fell from them. These were present in some places and absent in others, and where they were absent, the beach was simply a beach, open, approachable, an invitation to the kind of landing that Rommel most feared and most needed to prevent. He drove his staff harder. He drove the labour teams harder. He drove the soldiers of the coastal divisions, men who had in many cases been assigned to the Atlantic Wall, because they were considered insufficiently mobile or sufficiently recovered from wounds sustained elsewhere to serve in a more demanding theatre, men who had been told that this was a quiet posting, that the invasion might never come, that if it did come, they had only to hold for 24 hours until the Panzer reserves arrived. He drove all of them with the particular urgency of a man who had understood, at a level below argument, that the problem was not being solved fast enough. The mines. The mines were the key and also the problem. Rommel wanted 50 million mines laid along the Normandy coast. He wanted them in the water. He wanted them in the dunes and the marshes behind the beach. He wanted a belt of mines so dense and so varied, anti-tank mines, anti-personnel mines, shoe mines, Amtella mines, and improvised explosive devices and aerial bombs repurposed as buried pressure-fused traps, that no vehicle and no infantryman could move across the defended beaches without encountering one. He wanted the mathematics of crossing those beaches to be so hostile, so numerically overwhelming in its lethality, that even an army of the size and equipment quality that he knew was assembling in England would find the cost prohibitive. He got, in the end, perhaps 6 million mines laid in the Normandy sector by June of 1944. 6 million was not nothing. 6 million was, in fact, a number that would kill and wound and delay. But it was not 580 million, and the arithmetic of the difference, the vast undefended stretches of beach between where the mines were and where Rommel needed them to be, was a debt that would come due in the grey dawn of a Tuesday morning in June, spring 1944. The farmland of the Cotentin Peninsula, the village of Sainte-Mère-Église. The men of the 709th Infantry Division had been in Normandy long enough to know its rhythms. The fog that came off the channel in the mornings, and sat in the low places between the hedgerows until midday. The particular quality of Norman light in later feet are known, thick and golden, the way it fell on the apple orchards, in a way that made even soldiers feel, briefly and without permission, something that resembled peace. The smell of the bocage, that word borrowed from the French because there was no adequate German equivalent, that described the ancient agricultural landscape of high hedgerows and sunken lanes that divided the Norman countryside into 1,000 small enclosed rectangles, each one a potential fortress, each one a potential ambush point, each one a small problem of tactics and geometry that the defenders had spent months thinking about, and the attackers would have to solve in real time, under fire, with imperfect information. The 709th Infantry Division was, to be direct about it, not a division that had been designed for a decisive defensive battle against the best equipped army in the world. Its division's commander, Generalleutnant Karl Wilhelm von Schlieben, was a capable officer who had commanded armoured units on the Eastern Front, and who understood, perhaps more clearly than some of his peers, the gap between what was on paper and what existed in physical fact. On paper, his division was a full-strength infantry formation with 3 regiments, and supporting artillery and all the administrative and logistical apparatus of a modern military unit. In practice, the division was built around a core of German soldiers, some of them veterans of other theatres, men who had fought in Russia, or Africa, or the Balkans, and carried in their bodies the specific weight of that experience, supplemented by large numbers of Ostlegionen, soldiers recruited from the occupied territories of the Soviet Union, Ukrainians, Armenians, Georgians, Azerbaijanis, men who had been given a choice that was not really a choice between further captivity and service in German uniform, who spoke little or no German, who had been equipped with weapons that were not always standard German issue, and whose commitment to a German cause they had no particular reason to embrace was, at best, uncertain. The arithmetic of the Ostlegionen was one of the more uncomfortable calculations that German headquarters preferred not to make explicit. There were, in the Normandy area alone by the spring of 1944, tens of thousands of these non-German soldiers embedded in the coastal defence formations. In some divisions, they constituted 30, 40, even 50% of nominal strength. They were counted on the rolls. They occupied positions on the maps. They contributed to the paper strength of units that looked, at the level of a briefing to Hitler at Berchtesgaden, like formidable military formations. What they would do on the morning that the Allied army came ashore was a question that the architecture of the Atlantic Wall had been built in part to render moot, because if the defences worked as Rommel intended, if the landing was defeated on the beach in the first hours, then the quality and commitment of every individual soldier in the line would be irrelevant. The problem would be solved by concrete and wire and mines and the geometric mathematics of intersecting fields of fire before it became a problem of individual human will. But if the defences did not work that way, if the landing forces got ashore, then the problem became very suddenly and very urgently a problem of individual human will. And the Atlantic Wall had no answer to that. February 15th, 1944. La Roche-Guyon, Seine-et-Oise. Rommel's headquarters at a chateau above the river. The argument had been going on, in various forms, for months. It was the central strategic disagreement of the German defence of the West, the one question that everything else depended on, and it remained unresolved not because the men involved were stupid or negligent, but because it was, in genuine truth, a question that could not be answered without knowing where and when and in what strength the landing would come. Information that the German intelligence apparatus, for all its effort, had been unable to obtain with anything approaching confidence. The question was, where do the armour reserves go? Rommel wanted them on the coast, not near the coast. On the coast, he wanted the panzer divisions, the heavy armoured formations, the Tigers and Panthers and Panzer IVs, The machines that had defined German military power since 1939, and that remained, in 1944, still among the most formidable weapons on a European battlefield, positioned within striking distance of the beaches, close enough to respond within hours to a landing wherever it occurred. His argument was the argument he had been making since the day he arrived. The landing had to be defeated at the water's edge, and the infantry alone could not hold the beach without armoured support, and therefore the armour had to be close enough to arrive before the Allied forces could consolidate their position. Hours mattered, not days. Hours. His opponent in this argument was Gerd von Schweppenberg, commander of Panzer Group West, the officer responsible for the armoured reserve. Gerd was a theorist of armoured warfare, a man who had studied the great mobile battles of the war's early years, and concluded that what was required was not dispersion, but concentration. Not immediate tactical response, but the strategic reserve held back from the coast, out of reach of Allied naval gunfire, capable of being massed at the decisive point once the Allies had revealed their true intentions by landing and showing their hand. His argument was that Rommel's plan would disperse the armour, commit it piecemeal, expose it to the crushing naval fire that Allied battleships and cruisers could deliver onto any target within sight of the coast, and waste it before it could be used as the instrument of decision it was designed to be. Better to wait, better to concentrate, better to strike once and strike with everything. Both men were right. Both men were wrong. The tragic completeness of the argument lay precisely in the fact that the evidence for each position was genuine, each concern was legitimate, and the resolution that was eventually imposed, a compromise worked out at Hitler's headquarters, in meetings that had the bureaucratic distance from events that all headquarters meetings have, a compromise that satisfied neither Rommel nor Gerd, and reflected the particular way that German command arrangements in 1944 had evolved into something that looked like unity of command, but functioned like its opposite. The resolution gave each man partial control, and neither man decisive control, and the result was the worst possible outcome. Armour that was close enough to some beaches to get into the fight, but not close enough to turn the tide, distributed in a pattern that reflected the politics of the argument rather than the requirements of the battle. The 21st Panzer Division was positioned near Caen, southeast of the Normandy beaches, close enough that it could in theory respond quickly to a landing. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, one of the most formidable formations in the German order of battle, staffed at its command levels by experienced SS veterans, and filled at its junior levels with teenagers who had been raised, literally, to believe that dying for Germany was the highest possible fulfillment of a life, was positioned further east, also near Caen. The Panzer Lehr Division, which was in many respects the best equipped armoured division in France, was positioned south of Chartres, 150 kilometres from the beaches it might eventually need to reach. And the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte, the division that had started the war as Hitler's personal bodyguard and become, through the crucible of combat on the Eastern Front, one of the most battle-hardened formations in the German army, was in Belgium, not Normandy, Belgium. None of these divisions could be moved without Hitler's personal authorization. That was the final element of the compromise, or the final expression of what the compromise actually meant in practice. The Panzer Reserve, regardless of what Rommel wanted, regardless of what any local commander assessed the situation to demand, would not move until Hitler said it could move. And on the morning of June 6, 1944, Hitler would be asleep. April 1944. The beaches of Normandy. Low tide. The obstacle program was Rommel's most visible legacy. The thing that visitors to the beaches in later years would most immediately recognize from photographs and documentary footage, the steel and timber architecture of denial that filled the beaches like a forest of metal, projecting from the sand at angles calculated to rip open the flat-bottomed hulls of landing craft, to impale the men who waded through the surf, to turn the beach itself into a mechanism of destruction. The Belgian gate, a steel frame 2 meters high and 3 meters wide, supported on rollers that allowed it to be repositioned with the tide, angled seaward to catch and redirect any boat that struck it. The Hedgehog, 3 steel rails welded at their centers into a shape that ensured at least one point was always facing upward, always facing outward, always presenting a steel edge to whatever struck it. The wooden stake topped with a telemine or an artillery shell, or simply with a steel cap that would punch upward through a hull. These were the passive soldiers of Rommel's army, the ones who did not need to eat, or sleep, or maintain their morale, who did not defect, or get sick, or wander about the harvest back home. They simply waited as the tide went in and out over them, in the cold and the dark, for something to arrive. The mathematics of what was required were daunting. The Normandy beaches selected for the Allied landing. This was not yet known to the Germans, but the preparations had to account for all of them, stretched across roughly 80 kilometers of coastline. To fill these beaches with obstacles at the density Rommel wanted required materials, and labour on a scale that the German supply system in France, already strained by Allied bombing campaigns against the railway network, was struggling to deliver. Rommel travelled the beaches himself, in his characteristic manner, getting his boots wet, picking up the sand and letting it run through his fingers, marking on his maps the gaps where the obstacle stopped and the open beach began. He noted the gaps. He ordered them filled. He came back a week later and noted that they had not been filled, or that they had been filled partly, or that the wrong type of obstacle had been placed in a position where a different type was required. He argued with the engineers, he argued with the logistics officers, he argued with the division commanders who told him their labour resources were already committed. He drove back to his headquarters in the evening and wrote letters to his wife, to Lucy, letters that said things about what he saw and what he feared in language that a censored wartime letter could not make explicit, but in which the weight of the unsaid was visible between every line. He was also, during these months, building something else, something less visible than the obstacles on the beaches, less countable, less photographable. He was building a mental model of the battle he expected to fight, the battle he believed could still be won if everything went according to a plan that required too many things to go right simultaneously. He was not an optimist by temperament, or rather he was an optimist by the habit of action, by the practitioner's faith that problems yielded to energy and will and sufficient preparation, but he was not an optimist by the evidence. The evidence, examined without sentiment, was not encouraging. The Luftwaffe, which was supposed to provide air cover over the beaches, was a diminished force, not destroyed. It would never be quite destroyed. It would still be producing aircraft and training pilots as late as 1945. It still had men of great technical skill and physical courage, but diminished, stripped down by years of attrition over Britain and the Mediterranean and the Eastern Front, reduced to a fraction of its 1940 strength in a theatre where air superiority was not a luxury, but the precondition for everything else. The Allied air forces that would accompany any landing would not merely contest the sky, they would own it. And a beach with no air cover was a very different mathematical proposition than a beach that Rommel's planning assumed. The Kriegsmarine, the German Navy, was similarly compromised. In 1940 it had been a force capable of contesting the Channel, capable at least of making any crossing expensive. By 1944 it was capable of mounting harassment operations, E-boat attacks on convoys, submarine patrols that achieved occasional success, mining operations that caused real damage, and real delay, but it could not stop a fleet. It could not sink enough ships to change the strategic calculation. The sea crossing, which should have been the first barrier, the first place where the mathematics of the defence could begin to reduce the numbers of men and equipment arriving on the beaches, was functionally conceded. Whatever came across the Channel would arrive. Rommel understood this. He understood it the way you understand something that cannot be changed, not with acceptance exactly, but with the particular clarity that comes from having exhausted the alternatives. The landing would come. The fleet would cross. The air would be allied. The beach was what was Leafeat. The beach and the minutes and hours before the inland reserves could be committed. The beach and the men like Heinrich Sevelo, 21 years old, thinking about the harvest, sitting behind a machine gun above a stretch of sand that had not yet been given its code name by the forces that were going to try to take it. They would call it Omaha, May 30th, 1944. Berchtesgaden, the Berghof. The briefing lasted 2 hours. The maps were large, the pointers precise. The language of the officers presenting their assessments measured in the particular way that language is measured when the audience is a man who had, on multiple occasions, screamed at generals for telling him things he did not want to hear, who had relieved commanders for failing to achieve objectives that no general in history could have achieved with the resources available, who had, in some documented instances, wept, and who had, in other documented instances, gone silent in a way that was more frightening than screaming. The intelligence picture that the Fremde Heere West, the German intelligence bureau responsible for assessing the Allied order of battle in the West, presented to Hitler in the late spring of 1944 was a masterpiece of confident incomprehension. The broad strokes were accurate enough. There was a large Anglo-American force assembling in Britain. It numbered in the millions. It had an enormous quantity of armoured and motorised equipment. It intended to invade the continent of Europe. The details, the specific units, their exact locations, their intended landing areas, the timing of the operation, were a mixture of genuine intelligence and Allied deception of such quality and scale that distinguishing between the two had become, for German intelligence, essentially impossible. Operation Bodyguard, the Allied strategic deception program designed to protect the Normandy landing, encompassed an array of subsidiary operations of almost playful ingenuity. There was Operation Fortitude South, which had constructed an entirely fictional 1st United States Army group under the nominal command of General George Patton, a fiction so thoroughly supported by fake radio traffic, fake unit insignia appearing in southeastern England, double agents reporting fabricated intelligence to German handlers, even fake landing craft visible from Luftwaffe reconnaissance. That by June of 1944 the German intelligence assessment listed FUSH, the fictional army group, as the most powerful single formation in the Allied order of battle. Patton was real. The army group was not. The Germans believed in it, with the conviction of men who had been shown what they expected to see. There was, at the highest levels of the German command, a settled certainty that the main landing would come at the Pass de Calais. The logic was, in its own terms, sound. The channel was narrowest there, the crossing shortest, the port facilities at Calais, and Boulogne the best on the French coast. The route from the beaches to Germany most direct, the symbolic significance of the Pass de Calais, the place the Wehrmacht had stood and looked across the water at England in 1940, substantial. Calais was where a rational actor would land. Calais was where the strongest German forces were concentrated. Calais was where the Atlantic Wall was deepest and most formidably constructed, which in another sense made it the last place a rational actor would choose. The Allied planners were rational actors, but they were rational about a different set of variables than the German planners expected. They had looked at Calais and seen the defences. They had looked at the harbour facilities and understood that taking them by direct assault was likely impossible, a feat à Dieppe, and that even if they took them, the Germans would destroy them before surrendering them, leaving the Allies with a port that functioned only as rubble. They had looked at Normandy and seen the beaches, 5 beaches in a relatively concentrated area that could be covered by naval gunfire, that lay within range of fighter cover from British airfields, that were separated from the major German armoured reserves by distances that might, given sufficient surprise and speed, allow the Allies to consolidate before the armour could be brought to bear. And they had looked at the distances and the logistics and concluded that Normandy was not only possible, it was the best available option. They had been planning it, in one form or another, since 1942. By May of 1944, the plan had been refined through 2 years of argument and revision and study into something that was, by the standards of what had previously been attempted in the history of warfare, extraordinarily detailed. More than 7,000 ships, more than 11,000 aircraft, more than 150,000 men in the first wave alone, with millions more to follow. The largest amphibious operation ever attempted in human history, assembled with the kind of organizational precision that was itself a weapon, the kind of administrative capability that industrial democracy had developed to a pitch that no military formation on Earth had previously seen or could adequately respond to. Hitler, at the Berghof, looking at his maps, still believed it would come at Calais. He would go on believing it with impressive tenacity. For weeks after it had become self-evident that he was wrong. June 1st, 1944. Normandy. The coastal positions, the soldiers who would fight the Battle of June 6th, arrived at that date through paths so various that any attempt to summarize them loses something essential: the specific texture of each man's war, the particular sequence of training and transit and boredom and fear that had deposited him at this specific point on the map. But certain patterns recurred. There were the veterans, the men who carried the Eastern Front in their bodies, men who had fought at Moscow in the winter of 1941, and come away with frostbitten fingers that never quite regained sensation, or who had been at Stalingrad and escaped the encirclement by some combination of timing and luck that they did not understand and could not explain, or who had served in the Caucasus or across the Ukraine and come to know the vast mechanical scale of that war, the hundreds of kilometers of front, the arithmetic of casualties that exceeded anything the Western mind had been prepared to understand. These men understood, with the particular knowledge of those who have been inside disaster, what it meant when the force balance shifted. They had felt it in Russia, the moment when the weight was no longer on your side, when the sheer accumulation of enemy capacity began to express itself in operational terms as an irresistible pressure that no local success could offset, when the mathematics of production and manpower said one thing, and the morale of individual soldiers said another thing, and eventually the morale lost, as morale always eventually loses to mathematics, when the deficit is large enough. They did not talk about this. They thought about it in the way that all thoughts that cannot be spoken accumulate weight and density, and some of them had faces that showed the weight without their intending it. There were the younger men, the ones who had joined in the years when Germany was winning, who had been formed by the particular triumphalism of 1939 and 1940 and 1941, when the Wehrmacht had conquered Poland in weeks, and France in weeks, and seemed to be in the process of conquering the Soviet Union in weeks as well, before the weeks became months, and the months became years, and the map that had been so dramatically red and black began, in the East, to shifte and compress in ways that no one in the propaganda ministry's photographs of smiling soldiers and burning Russian cities had prepared anyone to understand. These younger men were differently damaged. Not the accumulated weight of defeat, but the particular disorientation of those whose earliest beliefs have been quietly removed without any official announcement that this has occurred. And there were the Ostlegionen, the men in German uniforms who were not Germans, who had come to Normandy via prisoner of war camps and recruitment drives, and the logic of survival that had seemed, at some point in 1942 or 1943, to offer a choice between staying in a camp where the mortality rate from starvation and disease and deliberate neglect ran to 40, 50, 60% of the population, or putting on a German uniform and being told that this made you a soldier with rations and shelter and a gun. Many of them had made that choice. Many of them were now standing in positions on the Normandy coast, behind weapons they had been shown how to use, assigned to defend a country that was not theirs for a cause they had not chosen against an enemy they had no particular reason to oppose. Their arithmetic was the most complicated of all. The question that the Battle of June 6 would answer, and that no one standing on those beaches in the first days of June could answer in advance, was which arithmetic would prove decisive. The concrete and the wire and the obstacles and the guns and the mines, or the weight of what was coming, or the individual human calculation made under fire in a language that all soldiers eventually learn regardless of their national origin, about what was survivable and what was not. June 4th, 1944, the English Channel. A decision. Group Captain James Stagg, the meteorologist attached to Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, walked into a briefing room and told General Dwight D. Eisenhower that the weather window he had been waiting for was opening. Not perfectly. There was still cloud cover, still wind, still a sea state that would make the crossing uncomfortable and the landing hazardous for the smaller vessels. But the alternative was to delay again, to wait for the next weather window, which might be 2 weeks away, during which time the accumulated mass of soldiers and ships and aircrew fleet assembled for the greatest amphibious operation in history would have to be held in ports and anchorages and camps along the English coast. The secret straining at its own weight, the security of the plan measured in hours against the increasing probability that an accumulation of signals and sightings and intercepted communications would eventually penetrate even the most effective deception. Operation Ever Mounted. Eisenhower sat for a moment in silence. Then he made the decision that changed the century. He said, "We go." On the German side of the Channel, the meteorologists were seeing the same weather. They were reading it differently. The models showed a storm in progress, conditions unsuitable for amphibious operations, a forecast that would not improve for several days. General Feldmarschall Erwin Rommel, reading the weather reports and making the reasonable inference that no invasion would come in these conditions, had decided to travel to Germany to visit his wife Lucy on her birthday. He had been arguing for months about the Panzer reserves, and he had requested a meeting at Berchtesgaden to press his case again with Hitler directly. The birthday was the personal occasion. The meeting was the strategic purpose. He drove away from his headquarters at La Roche-Guyon in the early hours of June 5th, heading east, moving away from the coast at the moment when the coast most needed the concentration of his attention. His departure was not unique in its timing. June 5th and 6th had been selected by German naval and air planners as the dates for a major naval wargame exercise at Rennes, in Brittany, and a substantial portion of the senior naval and air force officers responsible for coastal defense were in transit or in Rennes when the landing began. Several German division commanders were playing war games, the kind of tabletop exercises designed to test responses to an Allied landing, when the landing they were gaming actually commenced. The particular cruelty of this coincidence, that the defenders had chosen precisely the right weekend to practice responding to an event that was simultaneously occurring, was noted in German accounts a feat of the war with the kind of exhausted black humour that soldiers develop as a defence against the unbearable. The gaps in the German command structure on the morning of June 6th were the product of a forecast. The forecast was wrong, and the consequence of the forecast being wrong was that the Wehrmacht, at the moment of maximum crisis, was not commanded by its best available minds, but by a set of deputy commanders and duty officers who had the authority to observe the catastrophe and the information to understand it, but not, in many critical cases, the authority to respond to it without seeking approval from men who were asleep or in transit or far from their telephones. June 5th, 1944. Night. The English Channel. The fleet moved. There are no words adequate to the scale of it. This is one of those moments in history where the historian's vocabulary, however carefully assembled, however precisely deployed, confronts a reality that exceeds it. 7,000 ships, not 7,000 ships moving in ordered columns from a single port, which would have been visible from space, which would have been detectable by any alert coastal observer, which would have announced itself with the unmistakable signature of an armada. 7,000 ships gathered from every port along the English coast, from Portsmouth and Southampton and Weymouth and Plymouth and Bristol and the Thames estuary, drawing together in the dark on prearranged routes, guided by lights that only those who knew to look for them could see, navigated by officers who had memorized the mine charts and the current tables and the rendezvous coordinates with the particular intensity of those who understood that getting this wrong meant something worse than being wrong. The sea state was 2 to 3 meters, not catastrophic, not comfortable. The landing crayfeet, the LCVPs, and LCTs and LCIs that would carry the men to the beaches were not designed for comfort. They were designed to survive the surf long enough to deliver their cargo, and comfort was not in their specifications. The men inside them were cold and wet, and many of them were sick. The particular maritime sickness, but does not care about the cause or importance of what you are crossing the water to do, that levels generals and privates with equal and indiscriminate physiological thoroughness. They had eaten, they had been told to eat, by medical officers who understood that men who have not eaten cannot fight effectively. But the logic of the instruction did not fully overcome the instinct of the body in a 6-foot swell, and many of them were now managing the consequences of having followed advice that their bodies disagreed with. They were thinking various things. Some of them were thinking about the briefings, the photographs of the beaches they had studied for weeks, the terrain models, the tide tables, the positions of the German gun emplacements marked in red on the maps, the specific objectives for specific units at specific times. Some of them were thinking about home, about the things that the word home meant to soldiers who had been away long enough for the concept to have become something more abstract and more precious than geography, something closer to a direction than a destination. Some of them were thinking about nothing at all, having arrived at the particular emptiness that comes when thought has exhausted itself against an approaching event that cannot be influenced by thinking. Some of them were praying in the various languages and traditions and private vocabularies that soldiers use to address whatever they believe might be listening. Above them, in the darkness, the first aircraft were already crossing the coast. June 5th, 6, 1944. 23 o'clock to 2 o'clock. The skies over Normandy. The paratroopers came in 2 streams, from east and west. From the west, the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions of the United States Army, approximately 13,000 men loaded into C-47 transport aircraft that had gathered at airfields across southern England and were now boring through the dark over the channel in formations dense. Enough that the sound of their engines was a physical sensation, something felt in the chest as much as heard with the ears. From the east, the 6th Airborne Division of the British Army, with the specific mission of securing the Leafeat flank of the landing zone, of taking the bridges over the Orne River and the Caen Canal, of destroying the Merville battery that threatened the landing beaches from the east. The plan was simple in concept and ferociously complex in execution. The paratroopers would land inland from the beaches, disrupt German communications and movements, prevent or delay the arrival of reinforcements at the coast, secure key terrain features that the landing forces would need in order to survive and advance. They would do this in the dark, in unfamiliar terrain, under fire, separated from their units by the inevitable dispersion of a mass parachute drop conducted at night, with inadequate visibility, and heavy anti-aircraft fire and aircraft pilots, who were, in many cases, already beginning to break formation before reaching the drop zones due to the intensity of the German response. The dispersion was severe, Of the 13,000 American paratroopers who jumped that night, relatively few landed on or near their designated drop zones. The rest were scattered across hundreds of square kilometers of Norman countryside, from the marshes that German engineers had deliberately flooded to trap airborne forces, to the bocage, to the villages, to the orchards, to the fields that were in some cases still burning from incendiary devices that earlier aircraft feet had dropped to mark the target areas. Men landed in trees, men landed in water, men landed in the middle of German military camps and were killed before they could remove their parachute harnesses. Men landed alone in fields they could not identify, in darkness so complete that the discipline of their training was the only navigation tool they possessed. And yet, the very chaos that the dispersion created also created something that the German defenders found, in the hours that followed, more difficult to respond to than a compact, concentrated airborne force would have been. The Germans knew paratroopers had landed. They did not know where. They did not know in what strength. They did not know the objective. The reports flooding into German headquarters from across the Cotentin Peninsula and the area behind the eastern beaches described paratroopers here, paratroopers there, firefights in this village and that road junction and this farmhouse, a pattern of contact, so widely distributed and so fragmented that it was impossible to identify a main effort, impossible to determine which contacts represented the actual axis of the Allied plan and which were the accidental consequences of dispersion. The arithmetic of the uncertainty was, in its way, a weapon. Every German unit in the area behind the beaches spent the night responding to threats, real and imagined, tying down forces that would have been more useful at the water's edge. General Wilhelm Falley, commander of the 91st Air Landing Division, was returning by car to his headquarters from the war games at Rennes when his vehicle was stopped by paratroopers in the dark. He died in the firefight that followed, the first German general officer to be killed on June 6, 1944. His division, without its commander, would spend the critical hours of the landing morning attempting to orient itself in the situation that kept changing shape before it could be grasped. June 6, 1944. 2 o'clock. German headquarters in Normandy. The duty officers were receiving reports and could not make sense of them. This is one of those historical moments where the distance of 80 years can obscure how genuinely disorienting the situation was for the men experiencing it in real time. From their perspective in the darkness of the early morning of June 6, with paratroopers reported from dozens of different locations, with senior commanders unavailable or out of position, with the doctrine telling them that the main landing would come at Calais, and with nothing yet visible on the beaches below, the most rational interpretation of the available data was not immediately obvious. It might be a diversion, a large-scale commando operation designed to draw attention and resources away from the actual main effort, wherever that might be. It might be the vanguard of an airborne operation, but if so, what were the objectives? The reports were too scattered, too fragmented, too contradictory to form a coherent picture. The dots would not connect. 7th Army, the formation responsible for the defence of Normandy, issued its first alert in the early morning hours. The alert was real. The recognition that something significant was happening was real, but the response was limited by the same structural problem that had been building for months, the problem that Rommel had argued about, and that the compromise at Hitler's headquarters had failed to resolve. The Panzer Reserves could not move without authorization from OKW, the Wehrmacht High Command, and OKW was reluctant to provide that authorization before the situation had been clarified, before it was clear that Normandy was the real landing and not the deception, before it was certain that releasing the armour to Normandy was not stripping the real defence away from Calais. At 3 o'clock, General Major Hans Speidel, Rommel's Chief of Staff at Army Group B headquarters, reviewed the incoming reports and called his commander. Rommel was at home in Herlingen, near Ulm, hundreds of kilometers to the east. The conversation was brief. Speidel told Rommel what the reports showed. Rommel, who had spent months arguing that this moment would arrive, and that the response to it had to be immediate and overwhelming, learned that the moment had arrived on the one night he had chosen to be away from his post. He began preparing to return to Normandy. He would not arrive in time to influence the battle on the beach. June 6th, 1944, 5:30. The sea off the Normandy coast. The naval bombardment began. To describe it in physical terms is to describe an event that had no precedent in the experience of any living person. The Allied naval force comprised 6 battleships, 23 cruisers, and 80 destroyers, firing in coordination with a prearranged targeting schedule against German positions along the coast. The amount of metal delivered onto the beaches and the positions above them in the hour before the landing Crayfeet reached the shore was, by any measure, staggering. Battleship rounds weighing 1,000 kilograms each. Cruiser rounds weighing 200 kilograms. Destroyer fire faster and lighter but relentlessly accurate. Rocket firing landing Crayfeet that saturated the beach areas with volleys that each contained hundreds of projectiles. Bombers dropping their loads in the grey dawn. So many aircraft that the sound of their engines merged into something that witnesses described not as noise, but as a physical condition, a vibration in the air, and the earth and the body that had no precedent in ordinary human experience. The men in the German positions along the beaches experienced this bombardment in ways that varied according to their location. The strength of their construction, and whatever variable of individual constitution determined whether a human being could remain functional under conditions designed to be incapacitating. Some of the larger concrete casemates and bunkers absorbed the impacts and delivered their occupants shaken but operational. Some of the lighter field positions were simply destroyed, leaving behind the particular mixture of earth and timber and metal that artillery reduces field fortifications to, and many positions built with the precision of military engineering and oriented to defend against attacks from the sea were positioned in ways that reduced the effectiveness of the naval fire. The gun emplacements designed with their apertures facing toward the beach, their heaviest armour toward the water, were approached by naval gunfire from angles that meant the shells were striking the thickest part of the construction rather than the opening through which the guns fired. The physics were, in this specific respect, working in the defender's favour. But physics has limited jurisdiction over the human nervous system. A man who has been in a concrete casemate while 1,000-kilogram shell strikes the structure 6 meters from where he is lying on the floor, who has experienced the shock wave moving through the concrete like a punch delivered by something immeasurably large, who has had the air driven from his lungs and the sound driven from his ears and the certainty driven from his mind about whether the next impact will be the one that breaks through. That man is not the same man who went into the casemate before the bombardment began. He is a man who has been physically altered by what has happened to him, whose hands shake in a way he cannot control, whose perception of time and space has been rearranged by forces operating at the level of the nervous system rather than the rational mind. He may be able to function. He may, when the time comes, bring his gun to bear and fire it and reload it and fire it again with the mechanical competence of training. But the gap between what he was before and what he is now has been paid for by the men in the ships and the aircraft, in the currency of time and explosives, and the interest on that debt will be collected at the moment when the first landing Crayfeet reaches the sand. The bombardment lasted approximately 40 minutes. Then it lighted. The sea was full of landing Crayfeet. June 6, 1944, 6:30. The beaches of Normandy. 5 beaches. 5 different stories. The beach designated Utah at the western end of the landing zone at the base of the Cotentin Peninsula was the story that would later be summarized by the grim arithmetic of its casualty count. The 4th Infantry Division landed here, and the number most associated with Utah Beach is 197. The number of American soldiers killed and wounded in the landing, against the thousands who would die on other beaches, against the 160,000 men who crossed those sands in the first day alone. 197 was a number so low it seemed almost theoretical, almost as if the mathematics had made an error. The truth was more complicated. The landing at Utah was carried off course by currents, and by the initiative of a brigadier general named Theodore Roosevelt Jr., 86 years old, a son of the 26th president, a man who walked with a cane due to heart disease that should have kept him ashore, who arrived at the beach and discovered that his forces had landed a mile and a half south of the intended landing zone, which was actually more lightly defended, and made the decision on the spot to proceed from where they were rather than attempt to correct the error under fire. The wrong beach turned out to be the right beach. The arithmetic, for once, favoured the living. The beaches designated Gold, Juno and Sword in the centre, and to the east were the British and Canadian landings. They were hard. They were costly in the particular ways that any contested beach landing is costly. Men drowning in the surf under the weight of their equipment, men cut down in the water by fire from positions that the bombardment had not destroyed or had only partially suppressed, men working their way up beaches strewn with the wreckage of the crayfeet that had brought them there, through wire, and over obstacles, and around and over the bodies of those who had arrived in the first minute and the second minute, and who had not survived to see the third. But they were not Omaha. They got ashore. They pushed inland. By the end of the day, they had not achieved all their objectives. Caen was supposed to fall on June 6 and would not fall until weeks later, a feat of fighting of a severity that would leave the city a ruin. But they had established themselves on the continent of Europe in a way that no bombardment and no counterattack could fully dislodge. And then there was Omaha. June 6th, 1944, 6:30. The beach at Vierville-sur-Mer. WN 62. Heinrich Severloh had been awake since before dawn. He had heard the planes in the night, the sustained mechanical roar of fleets of aircraft crossing overhead in numbers that had no precedent in his experience. He had felt the bombardment as something physical, as something that moved through the concrete of his position, and through the sand under his boots and into his body, a vibration that the body registered as threat before the mind had processed it as information. He had watched the sea, grey and heaving in the morning light, and seen the shapes on the horizon that were not rocks, and were not clouds, and were not anything that the natural world produced. The beach below him, designated Omaha by the forces approaching it, Widerstands Nest 62 sector of a beach that stretched from Vierville-sur-Mer to Colville-sur-Mer, 5.5 kilometers of sand backed by bluffs that rose from 20 to 40 meters above the waterline, with 5 draws or valleys cutting through the bluffs that were the only practical exits from the beach itself. This beach was on the morning of June 6th one of the most naturally defensible pieces of terrain in Western Europe. The bluffs commanded the entire beach. Anyone on the beach was below anyone on the bluffs, exposed, and visible and approachable only across open sand, with no cover whatsoever. The draws that offered exits from the beach had been fortified with anti-tank ditches, and wire and mines and gun emplacements specifically designed to defend the approaches from the beach. The strong points along the bluffs, WN 62, WN 64, WN 65, WN 70, WN 72, WN 73, WN 74, and the others had been positioned to create overlapping fields of fire so that any point on the beach was covered by at least 2 and, in many cases, 3 or 4 different weapons positions. so that destroying one position did not eliminate the threat to the men on the sand below it. The German unit defending this beach was the 352nd Infantry Division. This is a fact of some significance, because it was a fact that the Allied intelligence services did not know. The planning for the Omaha landing had been predicated on the assumption that the beach was defended by the 716th Infantry Division, a static coastal division that had been in place for a long time, and that was assessed as having lower combat capability than a field division. In the weeks before the landing, the 352nd, a full-strength field division, recently arrived from training in Germany, with a higher proportion of German soldiers and a higher standard of training and equipment than the 716th, had moved into the Omaha sector. The move had been detected, but the detection had not made its way to the planners in time to modify the plan. The men of the 1st Infantry Division and the 29th Infantry Division, the American units that would land on Omaha, were going to face a stronger and more capable defense than anyone had prepared them to expect. The arithmetic was already wrong before the first boat reached the shore. 2 companies of the 2nd Ranger Battalion had been tasked with taking Point du Hoc, a promontory to the west of Omaha, from which a battery of 155 guns could cover both Omaha and Utah beaches. The Rangers had trained for months for this specific mission, climbing the 100-foot cliffs under fire using grappling hooks and rope ladders, then taking and destroying the guns. They scaled the cliffs. They took the position. They found that the 155 guns were not there. They had been moved inland to a secondary position some days before, a precaution against exactly the kind of attack that had just been made against the original position. The Rangers found and destroyed the guns in the secondary position, but the achievement of their mission had cost them more than half their strength, and they would spend 2 days on the point repelling German counterattacks before relief arrived. At the water's edge below the bluffs, at approximately 6:30 on the morning of June 6th, the ramps of the first landing crayfitte came down. June 6, 1944, 6:30 to 9 o'clock. Omaha Beach. The plan for the Omaha landing required many things to work simultaneously. The bombers were supposed to have cratered the beach, providing cover for the infantry, and destroying or suppressing the German positions. They had not. The bombing had been deliberately delayed to avoid hitting the landing crayfitte, and in the clouds and the uncertainty of the morning, the bombs had fallen inland, harmlessly, on Norman farmland far from the positions they were supposed to destroy. The specialized armor, the DD tanks, the duplex drive Shermans fitted with canvas flotation screens that allowed them to swim ashore, were supposed to arrive ahead of the infantry and provide fire support. Most of them had not. In the rougher sea conditions to the east of Utah, the decision had been made to launch the DD tanks at a distance that the sea state made effectively fatal. Of the 29 tanks launched in the first wave on Omaha's Dog Green sector, 27 sank within minutes of launch, their crews drowned in the grey water of the channel, the armor going to the bottom without firing a shot. The infantry companies that had been counting on tank support arrived on the beach without it. The German positions, battered by the naval bombardment but not destroyed, came to life. Sevelo placed his eye against the aperture of his position and began to fire. What happened on Omaha Beach in the first 2 hours of the landing is a thing that has been described in the accounts of survivors with a recurring set of words that reveal, through their repetition across hundreds of testimonies given over decades by men who were there, the particular reality that language was trying, and partly failing to contain. The word chaos appears in almost every account. So do the words bodies, and water, and screaming, and blood, and the names of men who were there and are no longer here. The accounts speak of landing crayfitte coming in, and the ramps coming down, and the fire hitting the men who tried to move, and the men in the water, and the men on the sand, and the German positions on the bluffs firing with a calm and terrible efficiency that had been built. into those positions by months of preparation, and that did not know and did not need to know the names or the stories or the reasons of the men it was killing. The mathematics were brutal. The 1st Battalion of the 116th Infantry Regiment of the 29th Infantry Division landed in front of WN-72, the strong point at the mouth of the Dog Green Draw, the main exit from the western end of Omaha. Company A, 100, and 64 men, most of them from Bedford, Virginia, a town of about 3,000 people, in the Blue Ridge foothills, landed into direct fire from WN-72 and the positions on either side of it. In 10 minutes, Company A effectively ceased to exist as a military organization. 68 men from Bedford. The mathematics of that number, measured against the population of a town that size, produced a percentage that the community's records would have to account for in ways that would take years, and memorial stones and the patient labor of grief to work through. Bedford's boys had been chosen for the first wave, and the first wave had been met by a defense that was working precisely as it had been designed to work. The German soldiers in the positions above the beach were firing into a target that the geometry of the landscape made uniquely favorable to the defender. The men on the beach could not disperse effectively. The sand was open, the water behind them was deadly, the wire and the mines limited movement toward the bluffs. They could not advance effectively. The draws were blocked, and the open beach between the waterline and the base of the bluffs was covered from multiple angles. They could not retreat. They could crouch behind the bodies of men who had already fallen, and return fire at positions they could not clearly see, and hope that some combination of suppression and maneuver and courage and accident would create an opening that the training and the doctrine said should exist. Somewhere in any defensive line, if you could only find it and exploit it before you were killed. Some of them found it. June 6th, 1944. 8 o'clock to 12 o'clock. The draws of Omaha. The names of the men who broke through on Omaha Beach that morning are numerous, and their individual stories contain, in aggregate, something that is both a testament to human capability under extreme conditions and a record of a cost so high that no amount of subsequent commemoration has ever quite paid it. Colonel George Taylor of the 1st Infantry Division, standing on the sand and looking at the confusion of the first waves, speaking a sentence that became one of the war's memorable formulations. 2 kinds of people are staying on this beach, the dead and those who are going to die. And then walking forward, Sergeant Philip Strachek, leading a gap blown through the wire by Bangalore torpedoes. Technical Sergeant William Courtney and Private First Class William Breiher scaling the bluffs at a point between strong points where the German coverage was thinner than elsewhere, demonstrating in a single act of navigation and courage that the wall had gaps. Destroyers that moved so close to the beach, in some cases within 800 meters of the surf, inside the minimum engagement range for most of their weapons, within sight from the shore, that their crews could see individual soldiers on the sand, and opened fire with everything they had on the German positions at ranges so close that the naval gunfire manual would not have recognized them as operational parameters. The fire from those destroyers did not decide the battle, but it suppressed, disrupted, forced heads down in the German strongpoints at critical moments when the men climbing the bluffs needed the guns above them to be occupied with something other than shooting them. By 9 o'clock, small groups of American soldiers were on top of the bluffs. Not many. 12 men here, 20 men there, but they were above the beach, above the strong points, at the positions the German defensive geometry had been built to protect, and the mathematics of the defense began to shift in small and then larger increments as the logic of the positions, designed to hold a beach below them, not to defend against men who had arrived above them, encountered the reality that the beach had been, at extraordinary cost, crossed. Heinrich Severloh fired approximately 12,000 rounds of machine gun ammunition on the morning of June 6. He also fired approximately 400 rounds of rifle ammunition. The expenditure represents a physical act of sustained labor that, apart from everything else it represents, attests to the scale of what was happening on the beach below his position. He fired until his ammunition was gone, and then he fired again when more was brought to him. And then he fired again. He would live with the memory of that morning for 60 years, until his death in 2006, in the village in Lower Saxony where he had been born. The specific weight of what he carried from that beach was not something he was able to leave there when he left it. The American commander who looked at the casualty figures from Omaha on the evening of June 6 and wrote his assessment used numbers that remain, by any standard, almost unthinkable. Approximately 2,000 Americans killed, wounded, or missing in action on that single beach in a single day. The largest number of American casualties of any of the 5 landing beaches, the only beach where the landing itself was, for several hours, genuinely in doubt, where the possibility existed that the force might be thrown back, that the mathematics of the defense would overwhelm the mathematics of the attack. It did not happen. But the margin by which it did not happen was measured in the specific choices of specific men on specific pieces of sand and bluff on a specific Tuesday morning in June. And those choices cost what they cost. June 6, 1944, 6:30 to 20 o'clock. Inland. The German response. The response that Rommel had argued for. The immediate commitment of armour, the counterattack that would reach the beaches before the Allied forces could consolidate, the moment when the weight of the prepared defence would be concentrated at the point of crisis and drive the landing back into the sea, did not happen. It did not happen for reasons that were structural, rooted in the command arrangements and intelligence failures and doctrinal disagreements that had been accumulating for years, and it did not happen for reasons that were specific to the morning of June 6th. The 21st Panzer Division, the armoured formation closest to the beaches, received orders to counterattack in the early afternoon. By that time, the British 3rd Infantry Division had been ashore for nearly 8 hours, had pushed several kilometres inland from Sword Beach, and occupied a belt of territory that was not, by any measure, the Soviet and disorganised landing that a proper beach counterattack was supposed to strike. The 21st Panzer moved north, toward the coast, through a landscape that the Allied air forces were making increasingly hostile to armoured movement in daylight. The division's advance reached the coast briefly, at a gap between the British and Canadian landing zones, demonstrating in a flash the potential of the counterattack that Rommel had envisioned, demonstrating that the gap existed, that armour could reach the sea, that if the full weight of the armoured reserve had been available and had been committed hours earlier, the gap might have been exploited in ways that changed the arithmetic of the day. But the full weight of the armoured reserve was not available, and had not been committed hours earlier, and the 21st Panzer's reach to the coast was brief and isolated. The armoured reserve was not released from OKW control until the afternoon, and by the time it began moving, the Allied air forces had made daylight movement sufficiently costly that the pace of any advance was measured in hours rather than the minutes that Rommel's plan required. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend received its orders to move toward the beaches. It moved, and was immediately set upon by Allied fighter bombers that had been assigned specifically to interdict armoured movement toward the landing zone. The 18-year-old soldiers of the Hitlerjugend, and many of them were in fact 18, some of them recruited from the Hitler Youth Organization that had shaped their entire conscious lives and told them that dying for Germany was the purpose they had been born for, drove their vehicles forward through a landscape that was periodically punctuated by strikes from aircraft feet that appeared without warning and disappeared before anti-aircraft feet guns could be brought to bear, and Lee feet behind burning vehicles and dead crews in amounts that accumulated kilometre by kilometre into a cost that expressed itself not just in the hardware destroyed, but in the time consumed The time that Rommel needed to be measured in hours was being measured in days. The Panzer Lehr Division, at its assembly area south of Chartres, received its orders and began to move. It moved 130 kilometers in daylight through French countryside that had been identified by Allied air planners as the axis of advance for German armoured reserves, and was attacked continuously from the air throughout the movement. The division's commander, General Lieutenant Fritz Behrlein, later calculated that the division arrived in Normandy having lost in the approach march alone, before engaging a single Allied soldier in ground combat, 40 motor transport vehicles, 5 tanks, 84 half-tracks, and self-propelled guns. The division was still a formidable force when it arrived, but the mathematics of the approach had already collected their payment, and the division's combat power, when it reached Normandy, was measurably less than what had started the journey from Chartres. The Luftwaffe's response to the landing was, by the numbers, almost mathematically invisible. The Luftwaffe flew 319 sorties over the landing area on June 6. The Allied air forces flew 14,000. The ratio roughly 44-1, expressed, with a clarity that required no interpretation, the state of German air power in the West in June of 1944. The few German pilots who made it over the beaches were, in some cases, pilots of genuine skill and courage flying in conditions that made survival a matter of luck as much as ability. They were overwhelmed not by individual Allied aircraft, but by the arithmetic of the ratio itself, by a disproportion so fundamental that individual excellence could not address it. This was, in miniature, the shape of the larger problem. Not incompetence, but imbalance. Not failure of will, but failure of capacity. Not the wrong men in the wrong positions, but positions that the mathematics had already decided before the men arrived. June 6th, 1944. 18 o'clock. La Roche-Guyon. Rommel arrived back at his headquarters in the late afternoon. He had driven from Germany through a France that was, by that point, showing him from the road what the radio had already told him. The contrails of Allied aircraft, the distant sound of something that was simultaneously the largest battle of the war, and, from the perspective of a car on a Norman road, a sound that filtered through the ordinary countryside as a kind of low, continuous thunder, without specific source or direction. He had spoken by telephone to Speidel, to 7th Army, to whoever could be reached. The reports told him that the beach had been reached, that the landing had not been stopped, that the strong points were still fighting in many cases, but that the Allied forces were ashore in numbers that suggested, to anyone willing to do the arithmetic, that the critical window had passed, the window in which an immediate armoured counterattack at full strength might have pushed the landing back into the sea. That window had closed while he was driving west, while the Panzer Reserve waited for authorization that took hours to arrive, while the 21st Panzer reached the coast briefly and then was pulled back, while the 12th SS fought through Allied air attacks toward a front that was already hardening. He wrote to Lucy that evening. What he wrote was not, in any conventional sense, the letter of a man who believed he had won the day. It was the letter of a man who understood, with the soldier's specific and irreversible knowledge that comes from numbers and positions and the weight of what has arrived, that the battle that had just begun was not the battle that could still be won by the methods available to him. What was required now was a different kind of calculation, the calculation of how to minimize the damage, how to trade space for time, how to make the Allied advance expensive enough in casualties, and material that it might become politically untenable before it became militarily inevitable. Whether that calculation could produce a result that constituted anything resembling victory was a question that the mathematics of June 6th had made it very difficult to answer yes. The Allied armies were ashore. They would not be pushed back. The wall had failed to hold. June 7th, -30, 1944. The Battle for Normandy. What happened after June 6th was, in a fundamental sense, the answer to a question that the landing itself had made inevitable. Not whether the Allies would establish themselves on the continent, but at what cost, and at what pace. The battle for Normandy that followed the initial landing was a different kind of warfare from the beach assault. Slower, more grinding, shaped by terrain rather than by the particular geometry of defended beaches, and open water. The bocage, that ancient agricultural landscape of sunken lanes and high hedgerows that Rommel's soldiers had spent months thinking about from the defensive side, became the medium through which the campaign was conducted, and it was a medium that, in some respects, favoured the defender in ways that partially compensated for the imbalances of June 6. The bocage is not, in military terms, a landscape that rewards the kind of war that armour and mechanization were designed to fight. Every field boundary was a potential ambush site. Every sunken lane was a potential tank trap. Every farmhouse and every orchard and every hedgerow top presented a small, specific tactical problem that had to be solved before the next problem could be approached. And the solving of each problem cost men and time and ammunition in increments that accumulated day after day into totals that the casualty lists eventually had to record. The German defenders who knew the ground and had prepared it and had had months to sight weapons and dig positions and identify the key terrain, used the bocage with the skill of men fighting in a landscape that rewarded exactly the qualities: local knowledge, the ability to inflict punishment, while maintaining a coherent, if shrinking, perimeter that the German infantry still possessed, even as the larger strategic balance shifted irrevocably. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, those teenagers who had been raised to believe in sacrifice, fought with a ferocity in the bocage south of Caen that Allied commanders described in their Rafita action reports, with a mixture of professional respect and the specific unease that comes from meeting an enemy whose commitment to dying for their cause exceeds what rational calculation would predict. The division suffered enormous casualties in the weeks after June 6th. It inflicted enormous casualties. The ratio between what it gave and what it received was, like almost every ratio in Normandy in June and July of 1944, ultimately unfavourable to Germany. But the absolute numbers, measured in Allied soldiers killed and wounded in the fields and lanes and villages south of Caen, were substantial enough that the Allied commanders who had expected to reach certain objectives by certain dates found themselves repeatedly recalculating in the light of a reality that was moving more slowly and costing more than the planning had anticipated. The battle for Caen became a particular expression of this grinding arithmetic. The city had been targeted for capture on June 6 itself. It would not be secured until July, and then only after fighting that reduced much of the ancient Norman city to rubble, and killing civilians who had survived 5 years of occupation, only to be killed in the liberation. The military logic of the fight for Caen was clear. It was a road junction, a communication centre, a pivot around which the entire Allied strategic manoeuvre in Normandy turned. But the human logic of it, the specific weight of each day's casualties on both sides, the particular cost to the civilian population of having history use their city as the medium of its resolution, was a calculation that no military plan adequately accounted for, and that the men doing the fighting encountered in its full reality every day. General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein, commanding Panzer Lehr, found his division committed to exactly the kind of attrition battle in the bocage that his tanks were least suited for, bleeding away combat power day by day against infantry, and artillery and air power in a landscape where the range at which armoured engagements occurred was measured in tens of metres rather than kilometres, where the technical advantages of German armour, the 88 gun of the Tiger, the superior frontal armour of the Panther, were less decisive than in open country, where a Sherman tank that would have been a disadvantaged opponent in a stand-up fight at 500 metres could survive long enough at 550 metres, in the right piece of cover, to kill a Tiger. The mathematics of tank quality gave way to the mathematics of tank quantity, and on the mathematics of quantity, there was no calculation available to Bayerlein or to anyone in the German army in Normandy in June of 1944 that came out favourably. The supply situation deteriorated continuously. The Atlantic Wall had been built in part on the assumption that if it held long enough, the supply problems of a landing force dependent on floating logistics over open beaches would manifest themselves as a decisive constraint on Allied operational capacity. The assumption was not unreasonable. Supply across open beaches was expensive, weather-dependent, vulnerable to disruption in ways that a defended port was not. But the Allied planners had solved the supply problem with an engineering achievement of audacious scale. The Mulberry harbours, prefabricated concrete caissons, and steel piers towed across the channel and assembled off the beaches at Omaha and at Arromanches to create artificial harbours capable of sustaining the supply of an army. The Mulberry at Omaha was destroyed by a storm on June 19th, an event that seemed, for a brief moment, to offer the possibility that the mathematics of Allied logistics might be subject to the weather in the way that Rommel had hoped. The Mulberry at Arromanches survived, and the pace of Allied build-up, temporarily reduced, resumed within days. The supply problem, from the German perspective, remained unsolved in the way that the German defensive problem remained unsolved. Not because the approach was wrong in theory, but because the resources available to implement it were insufficient to match what the Allies could bring to bear. By the end of June 1944, approximately 850,000 Allied soldiers were ashore in Normandy. German strength in the battle area was approximately 380,000, the ratio approximately 2-to-1 in manpower, significantly greater in air power, but with qualitative advantages to Germany increasingly offset by quantitative advantages to the Allies, was not a ratio that promised a stable outcome for the defence. What it promised was a further grinding down, a continued expenditure of German defensive capability against Allied offensive weight, at a rate that the German army in France could not sustain indefinitely against an opponent whose industrial base, 3,000 miles away from any German bomber, was producing soldiers and equipment at a pace that no calculation available to Rommel or to anyone in the Wehrmacht's Western Command could match. The mathematics which Rommel had understood since before June 6 were now expressing themselves in the only language they know, the language of what actually happens. July 1944. The hedgerows of Normandy. The cost of the bocage. To understand what the battle for Normandy cost in the summer of 1944, it helps to think about the hedgerows not as a landscape feature, but as a measurement unit, a unit for counting the human investment required to advance a few hundred meters in conditions that the terrain had engineered to be as expensive as possible for the attacker. Each bocage field was, on average, about an acre. Each field was bounded on all four sides by a hedgerow, an earthen bank 2 to 4 feet high, topped by shrubs and trees that could be centuries old, their roots so deep in the Norman earth that they were effectively immovable obstacles that tanks trying to climb them exposed their thin belly armour to waiting anti-tank weapons. That infantry trying to push through them were channeled through gaps that the defenders had known about and prepared for, and that became, in engagement after engagement, the places where men died. Each field therefore contained 3 or 4 engagements, each one a small tactical problem requiring reconnaissance. and fire support and maneuver, and the expenditure of men's lives in amounts that varied, but that accumulated, field by field, across the weeks of the Normandy campaign, into totals that the Allied commanders expressed in their reports with the measured language of military necessity, and that the families at home received in telegrams that used different language entirely. The American solution to the Bocage problem was a sergeant named Curtis Coolin, who designed and fabricated a cutting device, a set of steel blades welded to the front of a Sherman tank, made from steel cut from the German beach obstacles, that allowed tanks to push through hedgerows without climbing them, maintaining their vulnerable belly armor low and exposed only to the weapons of the defender rather than to the geometry of the obstacle. The device was fabricated in quantity and fitted to a substantial portion of the Sherman tanks available for Operation Cobra, the American breakthrough operation of late July. The steel of the obstacles that had been designed to stop the landing was repurposed as the tool that unlocked the Bocage. There is a kind of arithmetic poetry in that, the transformation of the defender's weapon into the attacker's instrument. But the poetry was invisible to the men who were still fighting through the hedgerows day by day in July, field by field, small problem by small problem, while the larger solution was being prepared. The German defenders, meanwhile, were performing a calculation that had no satisfying outcome. Hold the line and accept casualties that could not be replaced, buying time for a strategic shy feet that showed no signs of arriving. Trade space for time by conducting a fighting withdrawal, potentially creating the opportunity for a coherent defensive line further south, but conceding the terrain that had been prepared and fortified, and that the Atlantic War concept was built around retaining, or seek a political solution, accept the reality that the battle was lost, and negotiate an end, an option that was formally not available to any German commander under the political arrangements of the Third Reich, and that any officer who raised was likely to encounter consequences that made dying in the Bocage seem, by comparison, comparatively straightforward. Some of the German commanders in Normandy in July of 1944 were officers who had already begun, individually and privately, to arrive at conclusions about the war's outcome that they could not share with their superiors or act on in their professional capacity without consequences they were not prepared to accept. Rommel was among them. His conversations with several senior officers in the weeks after June 6th have been reconstructed, imperfectly, from accounts given after the war, and they suggest a man who was thinking not about how to win, but about how to end, about whether there was a path from the current situation to something other than the complete destruction of Germany that the current trajectory indicated. On July 17, 1944, his car was strafed by Allied aircraft on a road in Normandy. He was thrown from the car and suffered a fractured skull. He survived the wounds. His connection to the July 20th conspiracy to assassinate Hitler, indirect, debated among historians, but real enough that the Gestapo eventually reached his door, would cost him his life in October. He was offered the choice between a public trial and a private death, and he chose the private death, and the official version said he had died of his wounds, and the truth came out later, as truths eventually do. July 25th, August 21st, 1944. Operation Cobra and the Falaise Pocket. The American breakthrough that began on July 25th was the moment when the arithmetic of Normandy resolved itself into a verdict. Operation Cobra launched a carpet-bombing attack on the German lines west of St. Lo that was so intense it killed or wounded hundreds of American soldiers positioned too close to the bomb line, broke through the German position, and created the conditions for the kind of war that the Bocage had prevented for 7 weeks. Open country, movement, the fluid armoured advance that both sides knew was coming, and that only the terrain had been delaying. General George Patton's Third Army, activated on August 1st, exploited the breakthrough with a speed that made the German response consistently too late and too small. The American columns moved south and west into Brittany, then east and north in an operational geometry designed to encircle the main German force in Normandy. The German response, ordered by Hitler over the objections of the operational commanders who could see the trap closing, was to counterattack west toward Avranches, to cut the American supply lines, to reverse the breakthrough by striking at its base. The counterattack at Mortain was launched with 5 panzer divisions and was defeated in 4 days, not by weight of Allied infantry or by superior generalship, but by Allied air power that identified the armoured columns moving toward Avranches in daylight and struck them with a thoroughness that the open country made possible in ways the bocage had not. The Falaise pocket was the consequence. By mid-August, the German forces in Normandy, or what remained of them after 7 weeks of grinding attrition, were enclosed in a collapsing perimeter between the American forces pushing north and east and the British and Canadian forces pushing south. The gap between the Allied positions, at its narrowest, was perhaps 15 kilometres. Through that gap, for 3 days, the remnants of multiple German divisions, the 12th SS Panzer, the Panzer Lehr, the 116th Panzer, the 2nd Panzer, and others, attempted to escape before the gap closed entirely. What they left behind was a landscape that those who saw it in August 1944 described in terms that the vocabulary of ordinary military reporting was inadequate to contain. Hundreds of tanks and vehicles destroyed or abandoned, horses and men and equipment in the particular mixed tableau that the failure of a military force produces. A record of what it cost in material and human terms to contest an Allied advance for 2 months and then to be caught by it. General Eisenhower visited the Falaise area after the gap closed. He had commanded armies for years. He had read the casualty reports, had seen the photographs, had understood intellectually the scale of what the campaign had consumed. He was, by his own account, nauseated by what he saw. Approximately 50,000 German soldiers were captured in the Falaise pocket, an uncertain number. Estimates range from 10,000 to perhaps 20,000 were killed. Approximately 40,000 escaped through the gap before it closed. The escaped men were, in most cases, not the men who had defended the Atlantic Wall on June 6. Many of those men were already casualties, already prisoners, already dead, already on their way back to Germany in the particular involuntary transit that defeat arranges. The men who escaped from Falaise were the survivors of the survivors, men who had been through 7 weeks of one of the most intense ground battles on the Western Front since the First World War, and who carried in their bodies the specific evidence of that experience. They would fight again. The German army in the West would reconstitute, partially, and would fight again at the Rhine, and in the Ardennes and in the cities of Western Germany. But Normandy was over. The wall that had been poured, and wired and mined and garrisoned and argued about, was behind them. And what lay ahead was a rearward mathematics, the calculation of how much time and terrain could be traded for how much delay, that admitted only one eventual direction of resolution. The weeks after June, the coast they had leafed behind. The men who walked the beaches of Normandy in the days and weeks after the initial fighting had passed through were walking through a record, the detritus of modern industrial warfare, the particular mixture of metal and fabric and wood and other materials that the collision between the attacking and defending forces had deposited on and above the sand, was a text, readable to those who understood its language, about what had happened there. The steel hedgehogs, cut through by explosives, or pushed aside by the advancing tide of men and equipment. The remains of landing crayfeet, some of them stacked against the shore in positions that showed, with a kind of geological clarity, the sequence of waves of men that had come in, and the obstacles they had encountered, the bunkers and strong points of the Atlantic Wall, some of them intact, some of them broken open by the weapons that had eventually reached them. their interiors offering a tour of the domestic arrangements of men who had lived in them for months and had leafed in various degrees of haste. Letters, photographs, the personal effects that soldiers accumulate and then abandoned, the cigarette papers and the boot polish and the small devotional items that people carry when they think they might need more help than military equipment alone can provide. The mines remained in the sand for years. Some of them remained there still. The clearance work that began in the weeks after the landing, and that continued for years after, the armistice was the unglamorous last act of the Atlantic Wall, not the dramatic engineering project that Todt and Rommel had supervised, but the careful and dangerous work of removing one by one the individual components of the barrier that had been built to stop what could not be stopped. The Atlantic Wall's legacy in the landscape of Normandy is not, in the end, the strong points, though some of them survive, maintained now by the tourist industry that has grown up around the most visited battlefields in Western Europe. It is something more dispersed and less visible. It is in the geography of the villages, many of which were destroyed in the fighting and rebuilt after the war in ways that preserved the street pattern but replaced the pre-war fabric with the architectural conventions of the 1950s. It is in the orchards, some of which are still producing apples for the Calvados, that Norman farmers have been making for centuries, though many of them were burned or blasted in the summer of 1944. And the trees now growing are the descendants of trees planted after the war. It is in the cemeteries, the American cemetery at Colville-sur-Mer, above Omaha Beach, 9,387 graves arranged in a geometric precision that is itself a kind of military habit, persisting past the end of the military operation, each grave marking not the end of a story, but the interruption of one. And the German cemetery at La Cambre, 14,915 men buried under flat stone markers, in a style that differs from the American cemetery in ways that reflect the different relationship of the two nations to the meaning of what happened in the summer of 1944. The numbers of dead are, in any full accounting, larger than any single cemetery contains. The French civilian dead are difficult to count precisely, but estimates range from 15,000 to 20,000 people killed in the liberation of their country, killed by the very forces that were freeing them, by Allied bombing, by the crossfire of a battle conducted in and around inhabited villages, by the specific cruelty of the gap between where the shells were aimed and where they landed. The German military dead in the Normandy campaign, from June 6 through the close of the Falaise pocket, number approximately 200,000 killed, wounded, or captured. These numbers are the final arithmetic of the Atlantic Wall. They are what the barrier cost, on both sides, to build and to breach. They are the answer to the question that Rommel had been trying to prevent from being asked, by filling the beaches with obstacles, and the bluffs with guns and the mathematics of the defence with as much weight as he could assemble in the time available. They are the answer to the question that the Allied planners had been preparing to ask since 1942, that the soldiers in the landing craft asked with their bodies, that the paratroopers who fell into the Norman darkness on the night of June 5th posed to a defence that was strong in some places, and thin in others, and never quite strong or complete enough to matter in the way it needed to matter. Decades later, the coast of Normandy. Every year, on the anniversary of the landing, people come to the beaches. Some of them are old enough to have been there, a number that diminishes each year as time performs the only arithmetic that cannot be appealed. And some of them are young enough that the event is history in the way that the Norman conquest is history, something known from books and films, and the testimony of those who were there, apprehensible in detail, but not in the specific texture of lived experience. They walk the same sand, they look at the same sea. The sea does not remember what it has witnessed. It makes no distinction between the morning of June 6, 1944, when it was full of ships, and any other morning when it is full of only the specific emptiness that the sea maintains, regardless of what has happened in the vicinity. The bunkers are still there, or many of them are. They have settled somewhat into the bluffs, their concrete acquiring a patina that the 70 years since they were poured have given them, and they look now less like military installations than like geological formations, as if the bluffs themselves had secreted these angular protrusions from some process of mineralization, rather than from the labor of men under the direction of an organization responding to a strategic problem. Children play on them, tourists photograph them, the apertures through which the guns once fired, and through which men once looked out at the approaching fleet, now frame views of the same water, and in the right light. In the morning, the water still catches the light in that particular way. Grey and silver, the horizon flat and empty. The kind of morning that makes you think about the things that wait beyond what is visible. The veterans who have returned to these beaches have described the experience of standing again on the sand, decades after the event, with a consistency that suggests that the description of standing on the sand is also a description of something that cannot quite be described, the particular conjunction of the present reality of the place, unchanged in most of its fundamental physical properties, with the interior memory of what it was like to be there in circumstances that no amount of peace and normality and subsequent life has fully converted into the past tense. The beach is not for them just a beach. It is a site in which two realities coexist, the one visible to anyone who stands there, and the one that is only visible to those who were there in the specific hours that the place remembers, even when the people who were in it have forgotten or died, or otherwise ceased to be custodians of the memory. Heinrich Severloh went back to Normandy in 1964, 20 years after the battle. He went as a civilian, in the way that former soldiers sometimes return to the places where they fought, in the hope that the physical reality of the place will do something to the memory of what happened there, will provide some context or resolution, or simply some form of completion that the memory in isolation cannot arrive at on its own. He stood above the beach. He looked at the sand. He looked at the sea. What he was looking at was the same sea and the same sand, the same bluffs, the same drawer at the mouth of which the defenders had positioned their guns to cover the beach. He had been 21 years old the last time he stood in this place. He was 41 in 1964. The mathematics of those 20 years, the life he had lived, the farm, the family, the ordinary accumulations of a post-war German civilian existence, existed alongside the mathematics of the hours he had spent at this position on the morning of June 6th, and neither set of numbers cancelled the other. He would say, in interviews given in the final years of his life, that he did not enjoy returning to Normandy, that the place held something for him that comfort was not the word for, that the men who had died on the beach below his position were not, in his interior life, abstractions or casualties, or numbers in account, but something more specific and more present than that. Something that the 60 years since the event had not converted into the ordinary sediment of history. He was, to the end of his life, a man who carried something from that morning. The weight of it was his own to manage. In the privacy of the interior arithmetic that every survivor of combat lives with, the calculation whose inputs are never fully identified, and whose answer is always provisional, always subject to revision, always conditioned by the specific gap between what happened and what can be said about what happened, what the beach remembers, what the sea forgets. The story of the German defense of Normandy is a story that sits uncomfortably in most available frameworks for making sense of it. It is not, in the way that stories want to be, a story of good and evil, of heroes and villains, of a clear moral arithmetic that resolves itself into a satisfying judgment. It is, rather, a story of systems, of how industrial warfare in the 20th century operated according to the logic of production, and supply and logistics and force ratios, and of how human beings found themselves inside those systems, subject to their mathematics, shaped by their requirements, trying and sometimes failing, and sometimes succeeding at something that had no name in the language they had grown up speaking, because it was not something that the peacetime world had prepared them for. The men who built the Atlantic Wall believed they were building something that would work. The mathematics of their belief were not unreasonable given what they knew, and what they were told, and what the available evidence suggested. The men who tried to breach it believed they were attempting something that was possible, because everything that was possible had been done to make it possible. Both sets of men were right in their assessments of the problem, and wrong in ways they could not know about until the outcome was visible. And the outcome did not make either set of men simpler or more comprehensible than they were before it. The individual soldiers on both sides, Sevelo at his machine gun, Taylor walking forward on the sand, the teenagers of the 12th SS in the Bocage, the paratroopers scattered across the dark Norman countryside on the night of June 5th, the sailors of the destroyers who moved their ships into departments that their charts said were too shallow, because there were men dying on the beach who needed the guns. These individual human beings were not, in the moment of their individual actions, calculating force ratios, or assessing logistics, or making strategic judgments. They were doing something much simpler and much harder. They were deciding, in the time available, which way to move, and then moving. The decisions accumulated. The movements added up. The mathematics of those accumulated decisions resolved, over the course of a summer, into a verdict. The verdict was not about who was braver, or better, or more morally deserving of survival. It was about what the numbers said. And the numbers in June and July and August of 1944 said what numbers eventually always say when the inputs are what they were. They said it was over. What was over was not only the Atlantic Wall, or the German occupation of France, or the specific tactical problem of 5 beaches on the Norman coast. What was over, though none of the men fighting in the Bocage in July of 1944 could yet see it clearly, was the world that had made the Atlantic Wall necessary. The world in which a single European power could threaten to dominate the continent, could build walls of stone and steel against the ocean itself, could organize millions of men in service of a project whose end, visible now in the long retrospect of 80 years, was never quite what its architects believed they were building. What replaced it was not simple. Peace was not simple, or clean, or free of its own mathematics. The post-war world carried the costs of the war in ways that were both visible and invisible, in the rebuilt cities and the unrebuilt graveyards, and the children who grew up with fathers and those who grew up without, and the specific quality of silence in the houses where the silence meant something different from what silence ordinarily means. The beach at Virville-sur-Mer is quiet now. The tide goes in and out. The bluffs above the beach have been planted with grass, the same way that the golf courses of the living world prefer to have grass rather than the exposed chalk of the original geology. The apertures of the German positions face seaward, as they always have, looking out at the water from which the landing came, and which is now, in the ordinary calendar of a morning in Normandy, occupied only by the weather and the light and the fishing boats that have been working these waters since long before any of this happened, and will, presumably, continue to work them lona fide. The last person who was there has carried whatever they carry to wherever all carried things eventually go. The sea does not remember. This is not the sea's failing. It is simply what the sea does. It moves, it returns, it maintains its own arithmetic, the tidal arithmetic of moon and gravity, the slow arithmetic of erosion and deposition, the deep time arithmetic of coastlines that change over centuries in ways that make the changes of a single summer invisible against the longer duration. The wall that was built here is gone, mostly, or going. The men who were here are gone mostly or going. What remains is the beach itself, the bluffs, the light in the morning, the sound of the water on the sand, the same sound that Heinrich Severloh heard in the mornings when the tide was in and the beach was empty, and he was 21 years old and thinking about the harvest, waiting for something he knew was coming and could not stop and could not name with any word that contained its full meaning. The harvest comes. The harvest always comes. It is always in the end the most honest arithmetic.